Hello and welcome to Practical Inclusion. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wadawurrung people and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I was very fortunate to attend a lunch and learn yesterday by Karina Eccles, who is a local Wadawurrung woman, and she described the history of the Wadawurrung people for us in an incredibly emotional and vulnerable way. Really required us to, as she described it, deep listen. And I think the message that she was presenting to us about deep listening, particularly in this country as we head into next year, a referendum for us, which will alter our constitution, hopefully, to include a voice for First Nations people. And she presented her reasons for why we should vote yes to that. By telling us the story and the history of the Wadawurrung people, and I really appreciated that. So big, I guess, encouragement to people around Australia to really do that deep listening, to engage with the topic as much as we can so that we can vote in a meaningful way. My guest today is Leo Caldwell, and I'd love, Leo, for you to talk a little bit about the country that you're on today.
Yeah, so I want to acknowledge the Shawnee and the Miami tribes and just the gratitude to be on this land. And I am currently in Indiana in the United States.
Beautiful. Thank you for giving us some time today. I've been following you on LinkedIn for a while, and I just love the content that you post, the vulnerability that you present in your posts, which kind of feels like so necessary for people from the trans and gender diverse community to do, but also is obviously takes an emotional toll and takes a lot of courage, I think, to provide that authenticity. So if you haven't been following Leo, definitely jump on and do that now. Leo, I'd love you to do what I ask all guests to do, is tell us your story. How did you start becoming an advocate for trans and gender diverse people? You know, what parts of your story would you like to share with us today?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and I appreciate the work you're doing as well. I grew up actually in Indiana, which is a small Midwestern state, and it's very, very conservative. And I grew up Pentecostal, which was a very extreme religion that was very evangelical, very anti-queer, very anti-trans. And so I grew up at a time in a place where I didn't even know what was possible for me, right? I grew up under the idea that there was kind of one way to be right, to be good. And so through that journey, I knew I was queer pretty young. And then the trans thing took a while, mostly again, because I didn't know it was even a possibility. I was just totally in the dark of the fact that I could transition. And so in my 20s, I started encountering folks, and I started to deprogram from my religion, which was truly a journey. It took a long time, a good 10, 15 years, because not only were we evangelical, we had standards. So I couldn't cut my hair, I couldn't wear pants. And so there were all these things that like slowly I had to like take apart and become who I needed to become physically, even outside of transitioning, right? Just letting go of some of these standards. And so through that journey, what I realized is I was very private then because my family was not supportive, and they still struggle. And so because they are Pentecostal, but through that journey, I was like, you know what, if I don't tell my story, like I'm doing a disservice. And I was in a place of privilege, you know, being white and having a stable job, like all these things that I knew were surrounded in privilege. I was like, I've got to start speaking out and using my privilege to show possibility. And so in 2014, I started writing for different newspapers. I started writing columns, and I did that because I thought that audience, you know, this is probably 55 to 85 years old. And I was thinking this is an audience that really needs to know about trans people. And I did have a lot of really warm reception to that column. And it was truly just here's what it's like to be a trans person in America. Like, well, here's my version of being a trans person in America, because I don't speak for all trans people, which was also a disclaimer I would have to constantly put out there. But yeah, I think the last 10 years, years, I finally have settled into my bones and my skin. It took I'm 40, so it took a good 20 years to deprogram from the religion to finally say, you know what, I am who I am, and this is a good thing. It was really a wrestling with good versus bad, and I didn't see a lot, again, a representation of me in the world, and so it led me to start doing not really doing work around the community, more as just being visible. That was my first step. And my second step was I worked for a training company, and I saw all this training being done around, it's a lot of times it was sales training, but sometimes it would be HR training, and I didn't see myself represented. I didn't see any training about queer people, LGBTQ plus people. I just saw a lot of training about things that I felt like, sure, great, but where am I? And so I was like, okay, now I have this background in training. I have this identity that I feel like is not being explored or represented in the workplace, or not even being talked about at that point. So I started to do that education and that work. I actually started with a little like interactive branching piece where you decide to go which bathroom to go to as a trans person, because I did e-learning back in the day. So I was just using my different skill sets to like kind of get that word out, and really have loved it. It's interesting because at first I was really pitching it as training. I want to do training, but most people just want me to come talk, and they don't really want. So it's turned more into just speaking, which I love to do as well, but making sure that it's engaging and there's a back and forth, and really talking to the audience. So, and now I teach in higher ed. I'm actually in higher ed full time, and then I do the training and stuff on the side. But what I found in higher ed in the Midwest is a lot of queer kids come to college to find their identity, to like find their support in their family, because they're coming from homes that are not accepting. And so I've just been a really out lecturer, and I just have all the rainbow things and all the protect trans kids stickers, and I've had so many really awesome interactions with gender diverse youth. I say kids, they're not kids, they're actually adults, students. And they're great, and they come to my office, and they won't even be in our department, and they'll just come to talk, and it's really rewarding.
Thank you for sharing that, and that it's been interesting. I've had a number of guests on recently who have talked about a religious upbringing, and having to decouple from that, and at the same time as go through life changes around gender and sexuality. And so it's become quite a recent theme. I'm interested, you posted I'm not sure when, in the last week, around the myth of the gender binary. And I'd love to talk with you about something I've been dealing with very recently, is why are people so attached to the gender binary? It often just amazes me, and the Australian media is, I think, following a similar kind of cycle as the American media in terms of really highlighting these polarizing views around transgender people. Why do you think people are so attached to the gender as a binary?
Yeah. So first, I want to say that I think that, there's obviously a socialized and historical context, right? And really, when I think historically, this isn't about Indigenous people. This is about white centric ideas, right? And so I want to acknowledge that up front. And we're seeing more and more, scholars talk about this. We're seeing more information about it. That like we have this idea that like the gender binary exists in all cultures, but the reality it comes from white people. And so I want to say, like, I think it's white people passing it down, spreading this idea, because even we think about Native American folks and like the two-spirit. So there's these ideas of gender outside of binary, but with white folks, what I think is, one, obviously socialized. And so this idea that like, this is how it's always been, this is our social agreement that we were born into, and we have to maintain it. And I think the maintenance of it, really, obviously we talk about, is it fear? Why are we maintaining this binary? And I think sometimes what it comes down to is it represents possibilities. I think gender diverse people and trans people represent possibilities. I talked about how I didn't see those possibilities, but we represent possibilities in a world that is more equal, right? And has more equality. And we know that protecting privilege is important for some groups, right? A lot of dominant groups are trying to protect their privilege. And so when we start to represent things and possibilities outside this socialized agreement of this is the binary, I think people really get angry and want to protect that because they feel, I think there's one thing of protecting their privilege, but then there's this other piece that I think that maybe doesn't get talked about as much. You're born into a society, you're assigned, say, male at birth, and then you're expected to live within that box. And maybe a part of you didn't want to live within that box, but you have tried your best to live within that box and maintain these ideas and exhibit and show yourself in a way that stays within that box. And then here comes somebody, maybe a non-binary person, and they're just exploring all the things and wearing whatever they want, or, and for that person, that probably makes them really angry, right? Because they have spent so much time trying to maintain, like, this is what a man is, and I uphold that standard, and I agree to that social contract, and now you're over here not. And so I think that, it creates a lot of anger, it creates violence, and it creates death, right? And a lot of trans, and especially trans people of color, are murdered because we're trying, not, I'm going to say we, because it's white people trying to protect and maintain that gender binary, that social agreement. So I think that's a big part of it.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And also the other thing that I think interests me too is that, I also believe that for so many people who carry privilege, that privilege is invisible to them. Mm-hmm. And they're like upholding, you have to excuse me, I've got a bit of a cough this week. They're upholding, as you say, these boxes and, this system and this societal structure without even really understanding why they're doing that. Because they really haven't necessarily spent the time or needed to spend the time from their perspective to unpick what privilege even is in the first place, and then what that privilege is how that's affecting their behaviors and their need to kind of keep to those boxes. And I love that. Yeah, sorry, you go. No, I just love that way you describe that the people who have actually succeeded in conforming within those boxes, even though maybe that doesn't fit right for them, and how that must make them experience life when they look at people who just said, I'm not interested in that box.
And I honestly, as a white queer person, I wasn't even exposed to the idea that this was a white centric idea until just like a couple of years ago, and started reading about it, and I'm like, oh yeah, no crap. Like because I was soaked in the privilege, and it's, totally not aware that might be something that was a tool, used in white supremacy and colonialism. And like, I didn't think, of course I didn't think about that. And then once I started reading it, it was like, oh yeah, duh. Like that's what we do.
That absolutely makes sense. Yeah. On another recent post that you had, you talked about the urge that we have to separate people by gender. And my listeners will know that this irritates me to the hill. Particularly, I cannot believe how gendered our schools still are, and how they're still absolutely perpetuating this idea that gender is binary and not reflecting on the practices that they adopt within schools. What are some of the common traps that you find people lean into that actually reinforces the binary?
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest things that, not only is there like a separation, like you're saying, of like here, let's put the girls and the boys in separate spaces really early, right? Which I think creates so much division right off the bat. And like, we're like, why is there a wage gap? Well, literally when they're 4 years old, we're like, you were different, you were separate. But so I have a 10-year-old, and they are non-binary. And when they were younger, they were very traditionally male presenting, or, and at this point they hadn't really expressed any sort of identity outside of just like what was put on them, because they were like 4, and so they picked up some pink Minnie Mouse headphones, and we brought them to the counter, and the woman's like, these are for girls. And I was like, that right there is like the problem, is that we have objects, we have clothes, we have hair, and everybody has like sorted these things into these 2 boxes. And I'm just like, a pair of headphones, a hat, a shirt truly doesn't have a gender. When it's existing outside of our social understanding, our social agreement, it doesn't have a gender. So I think I hear people do this a lot, especially so I'm going to say cisgendered people do this a lot, where, well, boys are harder than girls, or that's for a girl and that's for a boy. It's just that like that need to like separate, and that need to like turn everything into a gendered item or a gendered expression or a gendered job. Like women can't do that, men can do this. And it's like, why? Like there's never that moment of like, why is this hat for men? Like what? There's no questioning. And I think again, it goes back to that socialization, like, oh, pink is for girls. Okay, but why is that the fact, you know? And I think that's one of the biggest traps is just like assuming, or not even assuming, just not even questioning why we think something is for a certain gender. Why can't it not be for everyone, you know? Um, and that's what early on, you know, telling my kid was, you know, was that, you know, anybody can play with that toy or anybody can dress that way. And I think for them, that really opened up, you know, the possibility that, hey, maybe I don't even feel like a boy, you know, and that's great. And I'm non-binary. And I think if we allow things and clothing and hairstyles to be for everyone, who knows, you know, like how people will express themselves, you know. And I just think that that's the biggest trap, honestly, is just gendering things and expression and just that like, and that policing around it too. There's so much policing around it. And then that's the other thing. Like if you see something that you think is traditionally masculine and you see a woman wearing it, why are you saying anything? Like why police it? You know, let it go. I think that's a big issue as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Some great points there for people. And as I always am talking to parents about, don't make the assumption that your kids are straight and cisgendered. You know, create a world where they can absolutely be who they want to be. And then they'll do the same thing. They'll create that world for the people around them as well, which just can undo so much harm, right? And where so many young people feel still the need to either maybe not even deliberately stay in the closet because they haven't had that ability and that visibility and that representation to really be able to explore who they are. You know, my story was similar to yours. I was 36 before I understood my sexuality, let alone my gender identity that came later. You know, we can prevent that in many cases by really, as you say, just breaking down this idea that things are for boys and for girls and doing that gender policing of it. What about workplaces? Oh, go.
I was just going to say that, yeah, I mean, on coming out day, we saw a few of these posts about, you know, and I made one about a world where we don't have to come out. And if we allow our children to not be put into boxes and not divide them based on gender, there isn't, and we allow them to know that anything is possible with your sexuality or gender, they won't have to. My kid said, you know, one day said, I'm non-binary. And I was like, okay. And they didn't have to say that, you know, and I think over time, like if they date boys, girls, whatever, like there is no need. They know that. I don't have any, like, I give them a lot of options now. And I think if we give more possibilities when someone's young, there is no like coming out. There is no like, maybe there is some confusion just because that's what you do. Like when you're young, you're figuring things out, not confusion, but exploring is a better word. There's some exploring, but we aren't going to have people in their 30s and 40s that are finally like, oh yeah, that's who I am. Because we gave them those possibilities much younger, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the key rebuttal to the comments that we hear that this is a fad and all these people are all of a sudden trans. No, we always were. Yeah. The numbers haven't increased. It's just society's providing a little more space. So if we move this conversation into the workplace, what are some of the key things that you think workplaces need to do to create more inclusive environments for trans and gender diverse people?
Yeah, I think I'm creating clear guidelines and policies that are inclusive of all genders. Like, what's the policy on transitioning in the workplace? You know, what's the policy on bathroom usage? And I'm not even, you know, let's say that you have a gender neutral bathroom. Even if you don't, like, what's the policy? You know, can anyone use any bathroom that they want to? Clothing, you know, again, LinkedIn has had a lot of good conversations around the idea of professionalism being coded for, you know, white, cisgendered, heteronormative. And so what does it mean to be professional in your clothing? And is that inclusive of all genders expression? And then I think another thing is bring in speakers, educators, like myself, and some, start thinking about like how are we going to support queer employees? Because some people are like, well, I don't have any LGBTQ plus employees. Great, but I guarantee your clients, your audience, whoever you're trying to reach, there are queer people in it. And Gen Z, which is like, I think like 14 to like 25 now, they are the queerest, most gender diverse generation ever. And it goes back to, it's not that we're creating more queer people, it's just there's more knowledge and more acceptance, and there's more possibilities. But so they're the queerest generation, and they're coming into the workplace. So maybe you don't have queer employees now, but you don't wait to bring in education when you have the employees. You do that beforehand, so the environment's already inclusive. I actually think it's really dangerous, and I've worked for companies that have brought me in and hired me, and they weren't ready to support me as a trans person, and it really damaged not only my mental health, but my career in that place. Like I was not engaged in the way I wanted to be because I was fighting so many policies and conversations. So you really have to create that environment before we show up. The third thing is use gender inclusive language. I'm from the Midwest, and one of the worst things we do around here, we do a lot of bad things. One of the bad things we do is we say guys for everybody, right? So like I really had to like work very hard to get that out of my system. But when I think about handbooks and when I think about internal documentation, how are you wording things? Are you using he/she? Are you just saying they, right? Are you saying like ladies and gentlemen? Or think about what you're saying and how you're using that language in the workplace, but also what is your documentation that employees are seeing, right? The fourth thing is support mental health initiatives and wellness days. Queer folks struggle with mental health issues, and that especially the trans and gender non-conforming population. And what we're finding is that the reason a lot of times we're having a lot of high depression and anxiety, it's because of the way we've been treated. It's not necessarily because, we've had these like mental health struggles for a long time. I feel like there was this idea that like gender diverse folks just really were having mental health problems at birth. Like they've just struggled with their identity so much. But the reality is they're finding through studies that a lot of it is the way we're being treated, the discrimination and the prejudice. And so have support in place in the workplace to support the fact that the reality is statistically we're going to have more mental health struggles, and be prepared to support that. I think be visible in platforms. So I see so many people during Pride, post things, which is great, but also back it up by donating to organizations. Don't just change your icon to a Pride flag, but also do something that month. Donate to, Trevor Project, or just an organization doing the good work of protecting and helping queer folks. So I think that's the big thing. I think some people get really, really into representing queerness in their organization during Pride Month, and then they disappear the rest of the year. And I think just keeping that momentum going is really important.
Yeah, I like that across those 5 things, you've really, tackled a whole variety of different elements within an organization. And, I'm sure you experience this too. Many organizations will just come and say, we need LGBTI training. And the idea is that that's going to fix everything. And it's a really important part, an important step of the process. But as you say, it's got to be aligned also with systems, processes, and policies that create that inclusive space. The amount of times that somebody reaches out to me and says, I'm in this workplace, they really need help becoming more trans and gender diverse inclusive. What can I do? It's like, were you employed as the inclusion person? You shouldn't have to be doing this job. The workplace should have created this space before you arrived. And so, yeah, it's some great tips there for organizations.
Yeah. One thing I'll add is I think it's very important to have written policy and procedures, because I worked for a company and they were like, well, we have values, right? And under our values, it's implied, right, that queer people are accepted. And I was like, no, anytime we have unclear policies and not supportive policies, whoever the dominant culture, the dominant group, then that becomes what's the norm and the value, and that becomes the protected group. You have to literally protect and outline how you're protecting the people that are not part of the dominant group. And I think that really, there is this movement, especially in America with, the whole Google vibe of like ping pong tables and like snacks, and we have values, but no, I want to see written policies. Like, you've got to write it down, and you have to show what you'll do if something goes bad, right? If an employee's not feeling supported, what's in place. And I think, organizations try to get a little squishy about it. And I think in this case, you cannot be that way.
And that comes to mind for me too, this idea that people will say, oh yes, well, our parental leave is inclusive for everybody. Well, it doesn't specifically say that. Mm-hmm. And so people from underrepresented or minority groups within your organization aren't going to count themselves into that policy unless it specifically calls them in. So yeah, big advocate for making sure we specifically recognize that our policies count for these people that we have in our workplace. I've totally loved this conversation. It's, you have this kind of really calm ability to articulate the thoughts that you're having and these ideas around the gender binary in a really, simplified way, which is what we need, right? Because it is kind of a simple thing, but it has become so problematic and so beaten up in so many ways that really, when it comes down to it, we were given this wrong idea from Western colonial society that there were only two genders. We now know that's different. Let's change our ways to make sure that we recognize that and respect that. Thank you so much for giving us your time today. And to my viewers, obviously you can catch Leo on LinkedIn. Is that the best spot for them to find you? And I'd really encourage you to reach out, and I imagine your presentations and training is incredible. Thanks everybody for tuning in. I know this was an early one for the Australian watchers, so you might be catching this on the replay. If you are, put some comments, questions through there, and Leo and I will both follow them and get back to you if you've got any great questions there. I want to do a call out again for the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Network. We had our meeting last week, our session last week, and it was, wow, it was an incredibly deep conversation about misdirected good intentions. And we've talked a little bit about that today. For many people, they are actually wanting to be good people, they're wanting to be inclusive, but don't always have the tools and the skills to be able to create that space. And so what do we do with people when we face that in the workplace? So we're going to put out a little bit of an article and a blog later about that particular topic, and I'd be interested in your thoughts about that. Lots of thanks in the chat. Thanks everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, Leo.
Thank you, Bree. I appreciate it.